Hello and welcome back to the Pondering Papaya podcast for your Australian Grand Prix preview. My name is Sam Cooper and joining me today is the Mirror's F1 correspondent Dan Moxon and host of the Grid Gab, Paul Landry. So let's get straight into it. So joining me now, as promised, is Dan and Paul. How are we both doing first, chaps? How are you, Dan, especially? I don't know if many listeners remember, but since we last spoke, you have had a child, so that's quite a big life update.
I have. Well, I think it's a bit unfair on my my fiance to say that I've had a child. She did most of the work, but yeah, no, we're all very well. Our new, very young family doing very well, thank you.
That's good and perfect training for Australia, surely, because I would imagine that's a lot of early starts, not much sleep.
Oh,
That sounds
4
just
a.m.
like Australia.
Yeah, 4 a.m. start is an absolute doddle these days. So yeah, no, I've been training for this for a while now.
Yeah, and hi Paul to you as well. Yeah, thanks again for coming on. How are you doing?
Not at all. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, very good. Thank you. It's been after this, the long start, for the season and everything. This 2-week break has seemed a lot longer than I thought it would. It's like you had that long drought, so then you have a nice 2 races back to back, and now it's like, yeah. But yeah, looking forward to Australia. Should be very, very good.
Yeah, you're very right. I mean, obviously, I was a bit like you, really. I thought the first two races seemed like they happened in one day after another, and now it seemed like we haven't had an F1 race for a good long time. But obviously, we have now got one this weekend. I mentioned it just then. It's the Australian Grand Prix, which I presume most of you will know if you're listening to this. Let's do a few of the little track bits. Albert Park Grand Prix Circuit is the full name. 58 laps, 5.3 kilometers, 14 turns. First race in 1996, and surprisingly, never won by an Australian. And I'm not counting Valtteri Bottas. I know a few people are trying to crowbar him into counting, but sadly not. McLaren in 2023, Piastri with P8 at his home race, and Norris with a P6. So let's start with Piastri. I mean, he's the hometown favourite, isn't it? Him and Daniel Ricciardo keeping up that tradition of having an Aussie on the grid, and obviously one of the most passionate fan bases, I think it's fair to say, especially as they mostly have to get up ridiculous times throughout the year. Dan, if we come to you first, Piastri going into this race, I mean, a few of his quotes, he was, I wouldn't say pessimistic, but I mean, he's always been quite a realistic chap, I'd say. That's probably a fair way to describe him. He was sort of saying P5 will be the absolute maximum. He thinks both Red Bull and Ferrari are still some way down the road. Is that your general consensus as well?
Yeah, realistic is definitely the way that he tends to do things. Although I think pessimistic is right for that prediction. I can understand it saying maybe McLaren might be the third quickest on track, but I don't see why that necessarily has to limit you to P5 because, Formula One things don't happen anywhere near as simply as that. One mistake, one, car problem, one brainless idiot taking you out at the first corner, and all of a sudden there's top teams with the best cars on the grid that are out of the race, or so things aren't necessarily as black and white as that. Especially when you look at the fact that Ferrari, which is one of the teams that he said would be ahead of him, you're either going to have in one of the cars, by his own admission, not 100% fit Carlos Sainz, or Ollie Behrman, who is, we all can agree, a brilliant young driver, but still inexperienced in Formula One. And you can't just necessarily assume that just because he's driving a Ferrari that he's going to be a shoe-in for a podium. So I think there's a great opportunity there for McLaren, and I think Oscar's doing himself down a little bit.
Yeah, would you sort of agree, Paul? Sort of where you see McLaren in this pecking order as it is?
Yeah, Daniel made a very good point. I think it's well, firstly with Piastri, I think it's a great little coping method for him, considering the what we might say the horrendous record of Australian drivers at the Australian Grand Prix. McLaren, though, they're definitely in much better shape than they were this time last year, and considering the not disarray that Ferrari's in, but certainly the fact that that one of their main drivers is down in Carlos Sainz. Behrman's very, very good, but he's still a unproven quantity. So maximum chance to take points off Ferrari for this race. Might be doing himself a disservice, but with Norris as well, he's always gone very well at Australia. So if there's perhaps a bit of first corner carnage, a little bit of action here and there, who knows what the weather's going to do? Maybe a podium, perhaps. Who knows? So I think that it's all to play for, really.
Yeah, I mean, you're right to pick up that point really about a podium potentially being on offer. And weirdly enough, just before we about to record this, I saw that Mika Hakkinen was sort of saying that Piastri is one of his choices for a podium. And I'm obviously Mika Hakkinen's got a lot of connections to McLaren. You sort of still got a soft spot for them. But for him to be saying like that, there must be something behind that. He's not just going to pull that out of thin air. In terms of the pecking order, sort of, it's just something we've already asked a little bit over the first few weeks of the season down. But if we look at it, I mean, everyone would sort of agree that Red Bull's really far out in the front. But in terms of Ferrari, are you saying that Ferrari's closer to McLaren than they are to Red Bull, or do you think they're closer to Red Bull than they are to McLaren?
I think definitely closer to McLaren than Red Bull, purely because I don't think anyone is really all that close to Red Bull at the moment. I think Ferrari are the standout second quickest team on the grid in these early weeks of the season, but I don't think it's by a great deal. And then again, if you look at that second to fifth between Ferrari, McLaren, Mercedes, and you can probably still throw Aston Martin in there as well, there isn't a great deal of difference between their pace. It looks like it could be another season where maybe the pecking order changes on a bit of almost a weekly basis, like it was at times last year. Which obviously for us watching as observers, that's great. That's great fun. Obviously, McLaren fans listening to this podcast would probably love a bit more continuity and to be at the top of that of that little battle. But from the neutral perspective, as they say, it's great fun.
And in terms of the circuit, Paul, I mean, it's a different one again to Bahrain and Saudi, but so far we've had 3 relatively quick tracks. I mean, all of them have got quite high speed sections. Melbourne's nothing different. Obviously, it's called a street circuit, it's sort of half in between a race circuit and a street circuit, whatever you want to call it. But McLaren last year were very good at high speeds, medium speeds, and yet we haven't so far seen them like be up there challenging sort of the same level as they were last year. Do you think that's a concern, or do you think that's just sort of them getting warmed up this season? I mean, should McLaren fans be a little bit worried that they haven't done better than they have so far this year?
I think McLaren fans should be happy that they're outperforming where they were last year. I mean, I remember in pre-season, before pre-season, actually, there was lots of hype about this one. But as soon as that started, remember, we started to see some long faces. There was a couple of interesting interviews from Norris and Piastri. But I think overall, the fans should be happy. I think that McLaren are where they are. They're currently in third place. I think the priority should be to build the gap between them and Mercedes and try and hold that. And if they do happen to chip away and take points off Ferrari, that's even better.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's quite weird comparing McLaren year on year because obviously this time last year, the team was like, as you mentioned, a completely worse, different place. Like they had an awful car. I mentioned earlier that Piastri got P8 and P6 in Melbourne last year. But of course, if anyone remembers that race, it was red flag heaven. There was about 4 drivers getting crashed. Both Alpines drove into each other. I mean, what Alpine would do now to drive into each other when they're the points, I mean, that seems hopeful these days. But yeah, it's obviously they've started a lot better. If we move on to Norris then a little bit, like, Dan, what have you made of his season start with? Because he was one of those drivers in Saudi that had that strategy where he didn't pit under the safety car because they brought Oscar in, and obviously it didn't end up working out for him. He didn't get that second safety car, and he's obviously now behind Piastri in the points so far. What have you made of his first 2 races? Sort of what's the vibe around Norris, do you feel?
Yeah, it kind of feels like Lando's yet to properly get going, to be honest, so far this season. All right, he's not been bad, don't get me wrong. No, and to be honest, it's not just Lando. I think the same is just for Oscar and for McLaren as a whole. I think it's it's been a decent start of the season. Certainly much better than they were at this point last year. But I still think that the best is definitely yet to come, and of course we know that there are things to work on that car. I think they're looking at sort of May, Imola-ish time before we get the first sort of major upgrades of the season for McLaren, which is, I mean, if it makes as much of a difference as it did last year, then that's obviously going to be a significant boost for them. But Lando in particular, it feels like I say, I wouldn't say he's had a bad start to the season, but I still think he's winding up a little bit at the moment. He's not really, he doesn't look like he's driving to his fullest potential at the moment. And that's what we obviously want to see from him in the weeks to come.
And do you think, just following on that, do you think a track like Australia, not only the track, but also it's rare that these two go into a race where Norris isn't the main focus? Obviously, he's the experienced driver. He's a big name in F1, whereas Piastri is a young rookie. But in Australia, obviously, that's completely different. Piastri was born about 15 minutes down the road. He's one of 2 Australians. Everyone's going to focus on him. Do you think that could potentially help Norris to sort of have like a little race under the radar and maybe do much better than a lot of people were expecting.
It could do, certainly. I mean, even that aside, Lando has gone very well at this circuit traditionally over the last few years. But then, yeah, like you say, you put that into it. Oscar's the big sort of local celebrity, so he's the one getting a lot of the attention. Whether that will be a case of, him being able to operate in the shadows or a bit, or maybe even just serve as extra motivation of, well, everyone's talking about Oscar, don't forget about me, sort of thing. It could really go either way on that front. I don't see why he can't use, whether he sees it as a, like I say, is in the background, or whether he does use it as extra motivation. I don't see why it can't be a positive thing for Lando. And yeah, like we say, it's gone well here before. There's no reason why it can't be a good positive weekend for him.
Yeah, just picking on what you said there. He's raced in Australia 3 times so far, scored 18 points, which is a good little haul, but highest finish of fifth in 2022, sixth last year, and I think he was 12th in his first year here. So, like you said, it's a track that he's done very well at. Just a minor thing to sort of clean up, I suppose, as well from Saudi. I'm come to you on Paul on this, but we all saw that fake jump start, non-jump start, whatever you want to call it, where it looked in the whole world that he'd made a jump start. I mean, Russell was very quick to point that out, got away with it for whatever reason for the censor, but there was just a little bit of an explanation this time around. He said there was some kind of light. I mean, obviously it's a street circuit. It's very hard to pick out normal lights. That's sort of why he jumped to it. So if moving on to that, because I presume he's not going to do that in the middle of Melbourne when the sun is shining. That excuse would be a lot harder to pull off when it's like that. What do you make of Norris? I mean, what's possible for him this weekend, but also possible for the season going ahead? Do you think he's going to get the same level of podiums as he did last year, or is it maybe a step back?
Well, for me, Norris, I think ever since, it was only a sprint race, but ever since Piastri kind of got the better of Norris in that sprint race, I think Norris is wondering what he's up against now in Piastri. It looked like when he was with Ricciardo, he was able to get the better of him. He was the young gun there, so he had that card to play. But if he got beaten by Ricciardo, he could also say, "Hey, look, I'm the new guy here." With Piastri, I don't think he was expecting Piastri to get up to speed as he did. And I think I don't know, particularly at this, as it is his home race, Piastri's home race, Norris is going to want to do everything he can to try and get the better of him, dislodge him, take away some of that spotlight and shine it back on him, I think. So, although it may seem very, very lovely between the pair of them right now, I think there's a lot of rivalry going on behind the scenes, and I think we are only just seeing the start of it now.
And do you think that's something that could potentially bubble up in the year? I mean, I'm thinking back. I mean, McLaren haven't had a load of driver attention. Obviously, I think you go back to Alonso Hamilton for the first, or maybe a little bit Hamilton Button, but obviously in the relatively last few years, they've all been quite nicey. Do you think we could see this year they start to get a bit more tense, a bit more, no, I'm going to be the top driver here? Or do you think Zach Brown and co are going to be able to manage that?
I think there will be more tension considering that I think McLaren are going to be a bit higher up the pecking order this season. I think they're going to probably take the place of where I'll take the place of where Mercedes were last year. There's going to be hopefully podiums on offer, and the pair they're going to be scrapping over it, particularly if there's things like team orders come into play, or if there's one driver is asked to do a favour for the other. They're not going to be as willing to do it, and it's even when you look at body language, even when you see Lando Norris when he's being interviewed and things after races, if Piastri has beaten him, he seems quite forlorn, whereas Piastri kind of still has this happy-go-lucky thing about him, which is great. But it's 1-1 between them now as we head into Australia, and huge amount to play for.
Yeah, I think you're right to pick up on the different, I don't know what we call it, but sort of the way they react to races. I mean, Lando has got this big reputation of being completely harsh on himself, hasn't he? He's the most harshest critic of himself. He could finish P2 in quali and he'd be annoyed he didn't get pole. Whereas Piastri, it seems like water's off a duck's back most of the time, doesn't he? He doesn't seem fazed by anything he does wrong or anything that's not gone his way. But that's just a little bit a difference between the drivers, I guess, and sort of their backgrounds. If we move on to McLaren as a whole, I mean, Australia's typically been quite a good circuit for them. I was looking over their history. Sixth most wins at this track. I mean, they've won 11 times here. It's a circuit it's done well for them, maybe less so in the last few years. But in terms of where their car's at, I mean, and Dan mentioned it a minute ago. I think a lot of people sort of pegged Imola as when they sort of get their first upgrades, and that's not surprising. We see a lot of teams wait for the European season to fully kick in before they bring a lot of their upgrades, purely on a logistics base as well as a timing one. Dan, if I come to you, like, obviously we're talking about Imola, but there's a few races in between now and then. Like, this Formula One season, we know goes quite quickly, even if there's 20 odd races. Like, you can lose a lot of ground quite quickly if you're not there. Do you think McLaren are going to be too far back if by that point, or do you think they're not going to be able to achieve their goals if they're waiting until Imola, essentially not sacrificing the next two races, but admitting they're not as quick as Ferrari and Red Bull, and the podium's not likely? Do you think that's going to ultimately come back to bite them later on in the year?
To be honest, no, I don't think so. I mean, Red Bull, they're not really in the conversation. They're in their own little world. I think, if you lose ground at Red Bull, that's pretty much inevitable these days for every single team on the grid. Ferrari, as I said earlier, I think they are probably the standout second team on the grid, but McLaren, I think, have a pretty strong claim for third, or to be battling for those, as Oscar said, fifth and sixth positions if they can be going for it. Obviously, if anyone then above them has any misfortune, they can take advantage of that. But as long as they're maximising the potential of this car on every race weekend, I don't see them being all that far behind. I don't see any reason why they can't be on par with the likes of Mercedes, probably ahead of Aston Martin the way that we are at the moment. And then, they bring that upgrade. If it has a big effect on them, then why can't they be challenging Ferrari? Why can't they be, making up for that? Any points that they do lose, any ground that they do lose to the Italian team, once they've brought in those upgrades. I don't see them losing an awful lot of ground as long as they get the most out of the package that they do have until they can bring, obviously, what they're hoping will be an upgraded version.
Yeah, we should point out as well, obviously these upgrades that are coming, like, they're going to be the first parts that, not to a huge extent, but a little bit at least, that Rob Marshall and David Sanchez, which are two very skilled guys, got on from Red Bull and Ferrari. I mean, the way that F1 works is these upgrades will have been in production or development a long time before these guys arrive, but no doubt they'll have had some kind of influence on it. But Paul, if I look at the season overall, like, going ahead, I mean, I guess it's quite hard to judge with just two races down, but going off a bit of what Dan said as well, like, do you think their main battle this year is going to be with Mercedes? Because, I mean, McLaren seem to be this kind of team that gets stuck in a battle with just one other team quite a lot. I mean, they had quite a few seasons where they were battling Alpine. That's obviously gone in completely different directions. But do you think it's going to be sort of McLaren and Mercedes, and P3 is ultimately what they're going to be fighting for?
I think, yes, I think it's going to be McLaren, Mercedes. Maybe on a good day, McLaren could be fighting 1-2 of the Ferraris. I think Alonso's Aston Martin, you could probably throw into the mix if he's got it on. Maybe that's just a one-car team for them at this stage. But McLaren at the moment, their base car, I think, is so much better than it has been in good years. They either start poorly and then have to develop their way out of trouble, or they start really well and then it kind of declines. What they've got now is a really great footing for the rest of the season. And yeah, they just have to keep it tidy, remind the drivers that, you're driving for the team. The constructors is the priority here. We need to keep third and push Ferrari as much as they can. I mean, as Dan said, Red Bull's up and gone, So they've got a great footing, and they just need to just remind the drivers, just for the love of God, don't take points off each other unnecessarily.
Mm-hmm. Before we move on to the other teams, I'm going to be harsh and ask you both for a sort of prediction. We both sort of hinted, but Dan, I'll come to you first. I'm going to want two numbers from you. So where does Piastri finish? Where does Norris finish?
Yeah, you are being harsh. You know what? I think, just even speaking about it earlier, I think Lando's got the potential to have a really good weekend this week. He shaved his. Can we call it a beard? It was.
I don't think you can. I mean, it was a very
glorified, glorified stubble, a bit like what you've got, to be honest, Sam.
Yeah, it's very true.
So that's gone. It means business. I can see, things go well, the stars align, maybe a Lando podium. And I don't see why Oscar couldn't follow that up with maybe a P4, P5 behind him, or obviously they could be switched around the other way. I think it's one of the most even driver pairings on the grid, the ones that McLaren have got, and Lando may not like that, especially considering he's got 3 years experience on Oscar. 3, 4? 20, yeah,
This is fifth
yeah.
season, I
Anyway,
believe. So yeah,
yeah.
maths.
Never my strong suit. But yeah, so it could easily swap either way around. But I don't see why one of these McLaren cars can't get on the podium if things go well.
And Paul, you sort of same school of thought for that?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, as we've seen with Australia, particularly the first corner, first lap, there's been plenty of accidents there. And my prediction is that we'll see, on on the first row, we're going to have a Verstappen and Leclerc, and I'm going to go completely mental here, and I reckon that there's going to be a slight touch, maybe an accident at the start with the pair of them. If you, with this season, if you don't laugh, you'll cry, and if we can just hope of some sort of action, something to happen, I think that'd be great. So, absolutely, what Dan said, podium definitely within a shout for this race. We'd all love to see Piastri be the hometown hero, wouldn't we? But I think with Norris and his experience and how he's always gone well at Melbourne, I think he is going to edge Piastri at Australia, I think. I'm sorry, Australian fans, of course.
Yeah, I mean it's great what you say. Obviously, hometown hero, everyone wanting to do well. I'm going to raise that there's one person that doesn't want Piastri to win, and his name is Daniel Ricciardo. I think if if Ricciardo saw essentially a guy in his second Australian race win a race he's never done, obviously Piastri had this. Oh, sorry, Ricciardo had this thing back in 2014 where disqualified off the podium, and it was interesting. Piastri spoke about that, saying that was one of his earliest F1 memories was Ricciardo getting disqualified. And then the following year, he was a grid kid for Daniel Kvyat, apparently. So that's
Yeah.
was his sort of early start. So we're going to move away from McLaren now, sort of touch what they're doing on this. And I think that's probably a good place to start, really, because obviously we come into Australia, we've got two Australian drivers. They're coming in particular, like completely different moods, mindsets, whatever you want to call it. Like a lot of jubilation around Piastri, a lot of sort of returning him home after such a good rookie year. Whereas Ricciardo, we're again sort of in this situation where no one knows how good he is, where he is in his career, what his career is doing. Dan, I'm going to come to you. Like, what? I mean, it's not been a good start, obviously, but sort of, basically my question is, what is Daniel Ricciardo? Like, I don't know what to just even describe him as anymore. Is he a good driver? Is he a bad driver? Is he doomed?
Not a bad driver. He is a good driver. Still doesn't mean he's not doomed. It's hard. We are 2 races in the season. This RB car, there was a lot of preseason hype around them purely because they were, obviously a lot of talk about them taking as many parts from Red Bull as possible, and you naturally assume that is going to end up with you having a quick car, considering how good Red Bull at making Formula 1 cars. Bit of an underwhelming start for them. The official record says 1-1 between Daniel and Yuki. In reality, it's 2-0 Yuki because Daniel only finished ahead because of that ridiculous team order in Bahrain that obviously got Yuki a bit hot under the collar. So obviously, I mean, first and foremost, you get judged against your teammate. It's the oldest cliche probably in Formula 1, but you really do. Yuki is essentially 2-0 up against him. The car doesn't look great. That might be what has prevented them from challenging for points so far. But yeah, it's not been the start that Daniel wanted or really needed. I mean, he came into the year talking about how much he really wants to get back to his old Red Bull seat. And, we're only 2 races in and we're already talking about, whether he'll even survive in the one that he's in. And it's certainly not a given that he will. And yeah, he's had a lot of bad luck here at Australia. As you mentioned earlier, the podium that got taken away from him. I think he's finished 4th 2 or 3 times. He's raced here 9 times, never a podium, and he's always been in pretty quick cars. I think a podium's probably going to be beyond the RBs this weekend. So yeah, I think he needs to score points. This is obviously a great opportunity to do so in front of a home crowd, a circuit that he knows very, very well. I think everyone in Australia and pretty much everyone in Formula 1 will be hoping that he does do it because, it's Daniel Ricciardo. He's a lovely guy. We all love him. We all want to see him do well. But the reality is this is, nice guys finish last, as they say. It's not just about what he's like as a person. He needs to deliver the goods on track and early weeks, but so far he hasn't done it.
And Paul, I'll come to you. I sort of asked this looming Red Bull question. I mean, flashback this time a year ago, it would look like a succession plan waiting to happen, didn't it? Ricciardo was back in the Red Bull family. Perez was under a lot of heat after a not so great season. And yet now we're in almost a complete role reversal where Perez is doing exactly what Red Bull want him to, and that's finish P2, don't touch Max, don't annoy Max, finish P2. And whereas Ricardo is out of the points, like Dan said, nowhere near them at the moment, like really struggling. Do you think that Red Bull seat is ever going to be his again, or do you think that's just a dream that's not going to happen?
No, I think that door's closed now. It's his. I think so far this season, he's just seen doors shutting on him. I think he's, unfortunately for him, Perez has just been fulfilling his job description to the letter, hasn't he? He's just been right up there, second place, doing absolutely everything he's supposed to. And he was just relying on Perez continuing to be troubled with what he has. I mean, remember last season, there was continuous rumours saying, Ricardo ready to step in, ready to jump in, and all this sort of thing. But he's just not finding his feet now. I don't know. It's really hard to pick out what's wrong. The vibe I get from him now is like, if I can use football as an analogy, where you have a player who had so much promise, but then they get sort of a career-altering injury. They've come back with all the same attitude, all the same talk, but they're just not the same for some reason. And that's the impression I get from Ricardo. I mean, he's the guy who, he dislodged Sebastian Vettel from Red Bull, and he gave Verstappen a rattling in his time there. So we know what he can do. He's if he jacked it in today, he's actually got a fairly good career to stand behind. I think he's got a lot to be proud of, Monaco Grand Prix winner and everything. But he needs to. I mean, let's be honest. He's currently where he is because he was hoping for that Red Bull drive to materialize. He's kind of cut strings at McLaren and Renault, obviously, of course. So, yeah, he's got to figure out, as you said, who or what is Daniel Ricciardo, as you said.
It's my favourite question. What is Daniel Ricciardo? Dan, one final question on Ricciardo. And it's another what if. Like, I mean, of all the drivers, there's probably a lot of what ifs going around Ricciardo. Maybe Alonso's the only driver with more what ifs surrounding him. But if Ricciardo managed to get into the Red Bull seat, I don't know whatever happens. Say Perez decides to jack it in and retires, Ricciardo gets it. Do you think that Ricciardo will be good in that? Do you think it's been a case of the car? Because that's obviously when he was at McLaren, we heard loads about how it was the car that was the issue. That he just wasn't suited to it, and yet he's come to RB, a car that's supposedly a lot like the Red Bull, and not sort of done it. Do you think something about him, like Paul said, something about him has just changed, or do you think if he did get back into a quick car, he would be quick again?
I think anyone that's on that grid can be quick in a quick car. They're there for a reason. It's funny that you mentioned Fernando, actually, because we're talking about this as though Daniel's still sort of the shoe-in replacement for Checo if he were to go. I think Mr. Alonso might have something to say about that, especially if an opportunity arises. He's already talking about, if things don't work out with Aston Martin, there's no reason why he can't go for one last hurrah. But on the point about Daniel, he had that test in Silverstone, this much lauded test in Silverstone that won him back his AlphaTauri. It was AlphaTauri at the time. His AlphaTauri seat. We know that Christian loves him. Christian absolutely adores Daniel Ricciardo. I'm pretty sure he'd adopt him if he could. I think part of the reason why Daniel's probably got the drive he has is because of the goodwill that he's got from Christian, and obviously we know he's got the relationship with Helmut as well. And the amount of influence that Helmut has there. Put him in a fast car, I think he'll do what Red Bull would want him to do, which is, he'd perform well enough, probably get a few podiums here and there. He'd probably have a decent shot at finishing P2 in the championship, but let's be honest, he's not going to trouble Max. To be fair, not many drivers on the grid probably would. So I think Red Bull will look at him positively from that perspective because he's someone that they can control. And that is important for them. But to be honest, I certainly don't think he's an upgrade on Sergio Perez, especially as we've talked about, the start to the season that Checo's made is doing everything he needs to do. He's doing exactly what he needs to do. He's sorted out his qualifying performances, or he seems to have so far. They've certainly been a lot stronger to start this new season. We know he can get it done on race day. He's always been strong in a race. So yeah, I don't see Daniel as an upgrade, and right now, I agree with Paul. It's very, very difficult to see how that move that even just a few weeks ago looked, maybe even likely, It's hard to see how that can happen unless he dramatically turns around his performances sort of within the next few weeks. He needs to get a move on.
Mm. And Paul, if you wanted your turn one incidents, Alonso, Verstappen, and the team, same team is sure to provide that. I mean, that would be something we'd all like to see. Just before we go, I mean, obviously, it seems every time we do one of these podcasts, there's more breaking news or more big news. We'll sort of ignore the Christian Horner stuff because that seems to have quietened down. He says in air quotes for the
Thank
mean part,
God.
but I mean, trying to avoid talking about that was quite hard. But yeah, if we go on to the FIA, I mean, it's the subject that's perhaps just been as in as much focus as Christian Horner has. We've had this news now that Susie Wolf's sort of doing a legal case, and she's sort of a criminal court case in France, obviously where the FIA is based, after the investigation of last year. I mean, just to run you through, if you don't know what happened, really, I mean, I think it was December. It was a few weeks, maybe even the week after the season ended. FIA announced they're looking into the relationship between Toto and his wife Susie Wolf. Obviously, Toto, Mercedes team principal, Susie Wolf, F1 Academy managing director. Ultimately, comes to nothing. 2 days after the investigation was announced, it's closed with them finding nothing. But it's sort of rumbled on since then. I mean, both Mercedes and Susie Wolf at the time hinted there'd be legal action. We haven't heard as much from Mercedes' side, but now that we've had it from Susie Wolf, obviously she believes she's got a grievance, some kind of criminal offence has been caused, and she's taken that to a French court, as I mentioned. Paul, if I go to you, sort of, I'm not going to ask you about the nuts and bolts of the legal case because obviously we don't know what's happening, and it's for the lawyers and stuff like that. But I mean, it's just another damaging look for the FIA, isn't it? It's not been a great year or 2 years or whatever since Mohammed Ben Salim's come in. What do you make of the news? Like, what does that look like for F1, really, that this is happening?
Oh, it's just a shambles for the FIA at the moment. I mean, the fact that this, like you said, this happened back in December, and they dragged Susie and Toto's name through the mud a little bit, and that quietened down. And I don't know if they kind of expected things to go away and go back to normals, but fair play to Susie for bringing this up again and challenging it and everything. But I mean, with the FIA at the moment, it just seems to be one thing after another. And we all, you look back at the days of Max Mosley and everything, and he had his bad points, obviously, but there was, that's a bit of an understatement, but serious bad points. But it was stable, and I don't know whether a change is needed at the FIA, and they need to get someone in who's a bit more transparent and a bit more upfront, and maybe kind of a bit more in line with what the audience and people involved in F1 want nowadays. But it's just seriously not looking good for them at the moment. It's every other week now there seems to be something coming up. Whether it's the Las Vegas Grand Prix situation. That's absolute shambles with them right now.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's something I've been saying for a long time is that he keeps making mistakes. You're right to mention the Las Vegas. I mean, he was cleared of any interference for that. As far as I can tell, nothing's come out about the other complaint, which is regarding the Saudi Arabian race of last year. But Dan, focusing on Mohammed Ben Salim in particular, I mean, I've often said that his position seems untenable, and yet he has another mistake. And to use another football example, it's sort of like FIFA of a few years ago, where it was just error after error after error, and these people somehow survive. Do you think he makes it to the end of his under his term? Sorry, like it's a 4-year term. If I'm right, that ends next year. Do you think he makes it to the end of that?
It's certainly hard to see him getting a second term. Let's put it that way. You're right. It's December 2025 when the new president will be elected. But yeah, it's just one mess after another under Mohammed Ben Salim. I should call him Mr. President. He gets really angry at people if you don't call him Mr. President. Yeah, it's everything is, and even going back to last December when all this stuff came out about this investigate, it was all so bizarre because the original sort of allegation of collusion or whatever it was between the Wolves was first made in a publication that I won't name it because I don't want to give it the benefit of having the publicity, but it's a glossy toilet paper is probably about all it's good for. So when it comes out in that sort of publication, and they may have more concrete evidence that they may base this internal investigation on, but we don't know because they've not been transparent about it, which is the really irritating part and the part that people want to keep mentioning. So on the face of it, it looks like they've seen this report in this magazine, which, like I say, is something that you'd use to clean yourself up after a visit to the toilet. And, launch an internal investigation based on this. And with no other seeming evidence, like I say, if there is more evidence, great, but, tell us. That'd be really handy. So yeah, no reason. No wonder the Wolves have been so irritated by it, and Susie in particular, because, I mean, even today, there's, all the last couple of days when this has come back up again, some of the news headlines around it is, Toto Wolff's wife launches legal complaint, and it's even just language like that. It's like, no, yes, obviously we have to mention the fact that she is married to the head of the Mercedes Formula One team, but she's a very successful driver and now businesswoman in her own right. And all that this whole mess has done is called into question whether she is basically in the position that she is because of who her husband is. That is the suggestion that's behind. It's not been mentioned explicitly by all of these reports and claims and investigations or anything like that, but that is essentially the inference. So no wonder she is pretty annoyed about it, to say the least. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to swear on this podcast, but I'm pretty sure she would. I'm pretty sure she's pissed off about it, and that's pretty light for swearing, I know. But I'd be absolutely furious in a position. I'm really glad that she's chasing it and that she's not just letting it go, because that's the other thing. It's been complete silence in public from the FIA since on this. They put out that statement of, oh, we're not actually investigating anything. That's it. We haven't heard anything since. So I'm really glad that she's chasing it and not just letting it go. That's great. Criminal proceedings was interesting. We don't exactly know what it is that she's, because we haven't got court paperwork or anything like that, so we don't know what sort of charge she's levied at them specifically. But yeah, it was interesting that it's criminal court. I don't pretend to be an expert on French law either, which obviously we know it's there too. So it'll be interesting to see what comes of it. But yeah, good on Susie for not letting it slide. It was nice to see her getting some backing on Media Day in Melbourne as well. Obviously, we knew that Lewis was going to speak out on that because he always does. So that was great. George did, and I think a couple of the other drivers too. So yeah, good for her. We'll see where it goes, and hopefully it'll be at the very least a lesson learned by the FAA that you need to be more transparent with these things. But as for Mr. President, Mr. Ben Sulayem himself, there's been so many things where you think that, oh, he can't survive this. This is going to be the one where they goes. This is where they're going to start impeaching him now. He's not been particularly well liked by anyone. I can't remember ever chatting to anyone in the paddock about Mr. Ben Sulayem, and they go, "Oh yeah, what a great guy. We love him. We're great friends with him." I've never had that conversation. Everyone has got their own issue about him. It's usually privately. Lewis came out and said today that he's never supported him, so maybe that might open the floodgates in that regard. But yeah, no, under normal circumstances you'd wonder how he'd survive, but he has before. But a second term is a different thing, so at the very least you would imagine maybe there might be someone different in charge of the FIA come the start of the 2026 Formula 1 season.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that seems like a perfect way to end it. Very well said. Slightly go back to the races. I'm going to ask you for a quick prediction. I did ask you for your podium, but I feel like we've sort of covered who we think they are. So maybe I'm going to get a dark horse. Let's go with a dark horse. I mean, we've all mentioned like Piastri and stuff like that, but maybe someone not from McLaren, someone you think might do better than expected. Sort of, they're not being talked about a lot. If any of you pick Alpine drivers, I'd be amazed. But here we go. Right, Paul, we'll start with you. Who's going to be your dark horse in Australia?
I'm going to go with Albon to get off the mark and get a point for Williams. I think that Melbourne would be a track that would actually kind of suit the Williams car. I think they're still suffering with the problems with the twisty turny tracks as opposed to the more straight line speed ones. I think this one's going to suit him. I am predicting the Alpine cars not to collide on the first lap. That's a bit out there, perhaps, but
how about lap 2?
I'm going to go with that. Yeah.
First 5 at least.
Yeah.
And Dan, what about you? Who's your underdog? Sorry, dark horse, not underdog. Wrong type of animal.
Dark horse, underdog. Same thing, isn't it? Potato. We talked about Daniel. I could maybe see one of the RBs going on into the top 10. I don't know if it would be Daniel or maybe Yuki. I think Yuki's had another pretty decent start of the season. As we say, we don't know exactly, how good that car is. It doesn't look particularly great. Haas might pull off some more shenanigans. They looked surprisingly quick last time out in Jeddah, but obviously it's still a street circuit, but it's different characteristics. Alex is always a good pick to do well.
Are you just going to name the whole grid?
I might, at this
your
rate,
bets.
I am, aren't I? You know what? I'm going to disregard all of that. I'm going to say I think Lance might perform pretty well this.
Okay, wow. What would that result in? A points finish or?
I mean, to be honest, I think a points finish is the minimum in an Aston Martin these days. But I'm going to say, go out there, a bit of a wild prediction, Lance to finish above Fernando.
Like it. I like a bold prediction. My thank you to both of you again. I mean, yeah, thank you very much for joining us, and good luck. I mean, you always have to say that ahead of Australia, especially us being based in the UK. It's going to be a few early starts the next few days. And then weirdly, stupidly, I've got a flight on Monday, so I have to go up early again. So lovely time for me over the next few days. But my thanks again to you both chaps for joining me, and enjoy the race.
Thanks very much.
Thanks so much. Thanks for everything.
Now, we've had a lot of bold predictions on this podcast so far, but I'm pretty sure you'll agree that Dan's Stroll prediction is right up there, let's be honest. Anyway, my thanks again to both of them joining, and my thanks to you for listening. We're going to be back on Sunday for a recap of everything that happened in the race, but in the meantime, enjoy the race, enjoy McLaren, and hopefully they both do well.